slipped it into my coat pocket while he was in the kitchen pouring coffee. I didn't notice until I was putting on my jacket to leave. A small folded piece of paper, torn from the notepad my daughter keeps by the fridge. 4 words in her handwriting, pressed hard like she'd been holding the pen too tight, Dad. Something is wrong. I stood in the hallway of her apartment in Kitchener and read it twice. Then I put it back in my pocket, buttoned my coat and said my goodbyes like nothing had happened. I shook his hand at the door, firm grip, good eye contact. He had that, at least. On the drive back to Guelph, I kept one hand on the wheel and let the other rest on my knee. The highway was quiet for a Thursday night. I thought about her face at dinner. The way she laughed a half-second after he made a joke, like she was checking his reaction before deciding how to feel. I thought about the way she refilled his glass before her own. Small things. The kind of things you notice when you've spent 31 years reading people for a living. My name is not important. What matters is that I spent 3 decades as a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Unit at the Ontario Securities Commission. I retired 4 years ago when my wife, Lorraine, was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. I wanted to be home. I wanted to be present. She passed 18 months later, faster than anyone expected, and I found myself at 64 with a pension, a 4-bedroom house in Guelph that was too big, and very little left to do with the particular set of skills I had spent my career building. My daughter is 31. She's a landscape architect. She designs green spaces for hospitals and long-term care facilities, which is the sort of work that tells you everything you need to know about the kind of person she is. She's always been careful, thoughtful, not the type to panic. So when she wrote those 4 words on that piece of paper, I believed her completely. I got home around 10. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and I wrote down everything I could remember about him. His name was Brendan. He'd been dating my daughter for about 5 months. She'd told me he was a private wealth manager. His words, apparently, not hers. He worked independently, not tied to any firm. He had an office downtown Toronto, somewhere near King Street West. He drove a leased BMW. He was 43, 12 years older than her. He had a way of speaking that I recognized immediately, the kind of fluency that comes from years of practicing sincerity rather than actually feeling it. The first time I met him was 3 months ago, at my daughter's birthday dinner. He brought wine, asked good questions, mentioned a cottage in Muskoka that he was in the process of purchasing. He talked about markets the way people do when they want you to know they understand markets. Loosely, impressively, without saying anything specific enough to be wrong. I hadn't trusted him then. But I hadn't said anything either. My daughter was happy. She seemed lighter than she'd been in years. After Lorraine died, we had both gone quiet in our grief, and I hadn't pushed. I told myself he was probably fine. The note told me I was wrong to wait. The next morning, I called a former colleague of mine, a man I'd worked with for 20 years before he retired to Halifax. I didn't tell him everything. I just asked him to help me run a quiet search on a private wealth manager named Brendan. Operating in Toronto, no registered firm. He called me back in 2 hours. There was no record of any individual with that first name and the last name my daughter had given me, holding a current license with the Ontario Securities Commission. No registration with IROC. No profile on the National Registration Search Tool. Nothing. That told me a great deal. A person can manage money without a license if they operate within certain narrow exceptions, but they cannot solicit investments from the public. They cannot hold themselves out as a professional advisor, and they absolutely cannot take discretionary control of a client's funds without registration. I didn't know yet if he had done any of those things with my daughter. I needed to know more before I acted, so I did what I'd always done when I needed to understand someone. I watched, and I listened, and I waited. I called her that afternoon, kept it casual, asked how she was sleeping, whether the new project in Hamilton was going well, whether she'd tried that bakery near her apartment that she'd mentioned at Christmas. She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. I asked if Brendan was around. "He's at a client meeting," she said. "He's been really busy lately." "How are things going with him?" I asked. A pause. Just a beat too long. "Good," she said. "It's good, Dad." "You sound tired." "I'm fine." "You know you can call me," I said. "About anything, I mean that." Another pause. Then, I know. We talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important, and when we hung up, I sat with the feeling that my daughter was frightened of something and was protecting me from knowing it. She had done the same thing in the weeks after her mother's diagnosis, when she'd been calm on the phone with me every night while quietly falling apart alone. I knew this particular silence of hers. I recognized the shape of it. I drove to Toronto 3 days later. I didn't tell her I was coming. I parked near the address she had given me once, months ago, when she'd mentioned meeting him for lunch near his office. I'm not going to pretend what I did next was anything other than what it was. I sat in my car and I watched the building. It was a glass office tower, the kind with a lobby directory and a concierge. I went inside and scanned the board. There was no listing for a wealth management firm under his name, nor under any variation of it. I asked the concierge, quietly and politely, whether they had a tenant by that name. She checked her system. They did not. The BMW was registered, I found out later through a contact, to a numbered company, incorporated federally 18 months earlier. The company had no website, no listed directors in any public database, and a registered address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service in Mississauga. He had built something that looked like a business from the outside. Like a lot of the people I had investigated over 30 years, he had understood that most people never check. Most people take the office address and the good suit and the confident vocabulary as proof of legitimacy. He had been right about most people. He had not counted on my daughter having a father like me. I needed to understand his angle. The frauds I had seen in my career fell into recognizable patterns. The most common one, when it came to targeting individuals rather than institutions, was the slow build. You establish trust. You create the impression of results. You get the person to invest a little, show them a return, then ask for more. By the time the money disappears, the victim is too embarrassed or too confused to go to authorities immediately. The lag time is your escape window. I needed to know if he had already gotten money from my daughter. I thought about how to ask her without frightening her. I thought about it for 2 days. Then I decided not to ask her at all. Not yet. Instead, I invited her to Guelph for the weekend. I said I wanted help going through some of her mother's things in the basement, which was true, and that I'd make her favorite dinner, beef stew with biscuits, which I also did. She came alone. Brendan was apparently in Vancouver for a conference. We worked in the basement for 2 hours on Saturday afternoon. I had put aside a box of her mother's scarves and jewelry. She sat on the old footstool and went through it quietly, and I sat on a storage bin across from her, and at some point I said, without any particular urgency, "He mentioned something at dinner last time about investment opportunities. Has he ever approached you about that?" She went very still. "A little," she said. "What kind of thing?" She put down the scarf she was holding. She looked at the box rather than at me. "He said he had access to a private fund. Very selective. He said most of his clients were ultra-high net worth, but that he was making room for a few people he trusted personally." I kept my face completely neutral. I had learned to do this a long time ago. "Did he give you anything in writing?" "A summary. A few pages. It looked professional." She paused. "I gave him some money, Dad. Not a lot. $40,000. $40,000. 6 years of RRSP contributions for a woman her age. A number that would have taken her a very long time to save on an architect's salary." "When?" I asked. 2 months ago. "Have you seen any account statements? Any documentation of where the money is held?" She shook her head slowly. "He said the fund had a quarterly reporting cycle, that I'd get my first statement in January." She looked up at me finally. "That's why I wrote that note, Dad. January came and went. He had an explanation. Then February. Another explanation. Then February. Another explanation. I asked him directly last week and he got..." She stopped. "He got cold, really cold. And then the next day he was fine again, like it hadn't happened. Like I'd imagined it." There it was, the pivot from warmth to coldness when pressed. I had seen it dozens of times. It is a control mechanism. It teaches the target to stop asking questions. "Do you still have that summary he gave you?" She did. She had it on her phone. She forwarded it to me that evening. I spent Sunday night reading it twice. It had the right vocabulary. It referenced a fund domiciled in the Cayman Islands, which is not unusual for private equity. It cited returns that were attractive, but not absurdly so, 8 to 11% annually over 5 years. Whoever had written it knew enough to avoid the red flags that unsophisticated investors associate with fraud. The problem was the things it didn't say. There was no fund administrator listed, no auditor, no custodian. The legal boilerplate at the bottom referenced to jurisdiction I couldn't immediately verify. And the fund's name, when I searched it against every database available to me through my old professional contacts, returned nothing. Not a registration, not a legal filing, not a single public trace. It was a fabrication. A professional one, but a fabrication. I called my contact in Halifax again on Monday morning. This time I told him more. He made 2 additional calls on my behalf. By Tuesday afternoon we had a clearer picture. The numbered company connected to the BMW also had a second entity linked to it through a common director, a name I didn't recognize, a woman in her 30s, whose LinkedIn profile listed her as a financial consultant with a history of working at firms that no longer appeared to exist. She and the man my daughter was dating had apparently incorporated 3 separate companies in the last 6 years. 2 had been dissolved. The active one was 18 months old, which lined up precisely with when he had likely begun this particular operation. He was not working alone. I thought very carefully about my next step. I had 2 options. I could go directly to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit or to the OSC's Compliance and Registrant Regulation Branch and Registrant Regulation Branch and report what I had found. That was the correct legal path. But investigations of this type take time, a great deal of time, and the money my daughter had given him was already gone into whatever structure he'd built around it. Reporting today did not mean she would see it back tomorrow, or next year, or possibly ever. What I wanted, and I will be honest about this, was to see his face when he understood exactly who I was. I wanted the moment of recognition. I wanted him to know that this particular Mark had a father who had spent 3 decades unraveling schemes exactly like his. I also needed to protect my daughter from any further exposure while the legal process began. That meant getting her out of his orbit before he had any reason to suspect the ground was shifting. I asked her to come to Guelph again the following Saturday. I told her I needed her help with something. I didn't tell her what. On Friday evening, I drove to Toronto again. I had asked my daughter earlier in the week to invite Brendan to a dinner she'd been planning to cook for a few friends on Saturday night. She'd said that was already the plan, so on Friday I knew he would be in Kitchener with her that afternoon, helping her shop for the dinner. I went to his apartment building. She had given me the address once in passing, the kind of detail you file away without knowing why, and I sat in the lobby cafe across the street. I was there for 40 minutes before the woman I'd identified from the corporate filings walked out of the building. She was carrying a tote bag. She got into a car. I took a photograph of the plate. He had listed his home address on the incorporated company's federal registration. That was a common mistake, the kind of small oversight that people make when they're confident they won't be caught. It meant his residential building was legally connected to the business entity connected to the fraud. That was useful. I drove home. I put everything I had into a clear, organized file. Then I called a friend who had joined the RCMP Integrated Market Enforcement Team when I retired, a man I had worked alongside on 2 major cases in my last years at the OSC. I sent him the file that night. He called me at 8 the next morning. "This is solid," he said. "I know." "How involved is your daughter?" "Victim. $40,000. A pause. "I'll get this to the right desk. It's going to take time." "I understand," I said. "I just need to know it's moving." "It's moving." My daughter arrived at my house at noon on Saturday. I made coffee and I sat her down at the kitchen table and I told her everything. Not quickly, carefully. I showed her the documents I had compiled. I explained the corporate structure. I explained what a fund domiciled in the Cayman Islands without a named administrator means and what it doesn't mean. I explained that the summary he had given her was designed to look legitimate to someone who had never worked in financial regulation and would not withstand scrutiny from someone who had. She was quiet for a very long time after I finished. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I started looking the morning after you gave me the note." "I was afraid to tell you directly," she said. I thought maybe I was wrong. I thought maybe I was being paranoid and that if I told you and I was wrong, I'd have ruined something. She pressed her hands flat against the table. I didn't want to be the daughter who cries fraud every time she dates someone older. You were wrong, I said. You were right the first time. Your gut was right. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the garden her mother had planted, and that I had kept up badly these past 2 years. What happens now? I told her. I told her that she needed to stop all contact with him, not confrontationally, just quietly, citing personal reasons, keeping the message short and leaving no room for negotiation. I told her that the authorities were already looking at what I had given them. I told her that the $40,000 might be recoverable, depending on how the investigation developed and whether any assets could be traced and frozen. I told her it might not be. I told her I was sorry. You don't have anything to be sorry for, she said. I should have looked harder when I first met him. She shook her head. You looked as soon as I asked you to. We sat with that for a minute. The coffee was going cold. Outside, a chickadee landed on the feeder that Lorraine had put up years ago and that I filled every week out of habit. Your mother would have seen through him at the dinner table, I said. My daughter almost smiled. She would have asked him one question and that would have been it. She had a gift for that. So do you, Dad. You just take longer to use it. I let that land. She wasn't wrong. She texted him that afternoon, brief and calm. She said she needed space and that she felt the relationship wasn't working for her. He responded twice. The first message was warm and concerned, asking if she was all right, suggesting they talk. The second, sent 40 minutes later when she didn't reply, was cooler. He said he understood, that he respected her feelings, that he hoped she'd reconsider. No anger, no pressure. That told me he was calculating, keeping the door open, avoiding anything that could be used against him. He knew that a clean, uncontested ending was in his interest. She did not respond to either message. The investigation moved more slowly than I would have liked, which is always the way with financial crimes. The documentation I had provided opened an inquiry, but building a prosecutable case required tracing the actual money flows, identifying other victims, establishing the intent to defraud across multiple transactions. These things take months, sometimes longer. What I can tell you is what I know now, a little over a year later. The numbered company was connected to at least 6 other individuals who had transferred money into the same phantom fund structure. The combined amount across all victims was just under $800,000. The woman who had been linked to him through the corporate filings turned out to be his sister. She had handled the administration side, the documents, the communications, the paperwork that made it look like a real operation. They had been running variations of this scheme in different cities for nearly a decade, always staying below the threshold that triggers automatic regulatory flags, always targeting people who were intelligent and successful, and therefore believed they could trust their own judgment. They had counted on that, I think, on the pride of capable people. Charges were laid in the spring. Fraud over $5,000, contrary to Section 380 of the Criminal Code. Breach of trust. I was interviewed twice as part of the investigation. My daughter provided a victim impact statement. She was not alone in that. There were 5 others. My daughter recovered most of her $40,000 through the civil restitution process. Not all of it, but most. I drove to Toronto the day the charges were made public, and I took my daughter to dinner at a restaurant near her apartment that she had been wanting to try. We ordered too much food, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. A new project she was working on for a long-term care facility in Waterloo. A cabin she and her friend were renting for a long weekend in Algonquin in July. Whether I was going to finally have the back garden properly landscaped or keep limping along with my inadequate attempts. I'll design it for you, she said, properly, if you want. I'd like that, I said. On the drive home, I thought about Lorraine. I thought about how she had always said that the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who has learned to perform trustworthiness without actually possessing it. She had said that about a neighbor once, a small observation at the kitchen table. I had smiled and agreed, and not thought about it again for years. I thought about it now. I thought about how my daughter had known something was wrong before she could fully articulate what it was. How the body knows things before the mind catches up. How she had found a way to tell me even when she was afraid to say it out loud. She had folded that piece of paper and put it in my coat pocket and trusted that I would understand. I'm glad I did not let her down. I have been thinking about what my daughter said at that restaurant in Toronto the night we went out after the charges were laid. She said I take longer to use my gift. She wasn't being unkind. She was right. There is a version of this story where I say nothing, where I see what I saw at that first dinner. The half-second pause before she laughed, the way she refilled his glass before her own. And I tell myself it's none of my business. She's an adult. She knows her own life. I've done enough damage over the years by being too present, too watchful, too much the investigator when I should have just been her father. There is a version of this story where I fold up that note, put it back in my pocket, and decide to stay out of it. I've thought about that version a lot. What my daughter did took something I don't have a neat word for. She was frightened. She had already given him the money. She wasn't certain she was right, and still she found a way to reach for me, quietly, indirectly, in a way that left her a path to retreat if she'd been wrong. That took a kind of integrity that most people don't recognize as integrity because it doesn't look heroic. It looks like a folded piece of paper in a coat pocket. But she chose honesty over comfort. She chose to trust someone outside herself, even when she was ashamed of what she might have to admit. That is not a small thing. I've watched capable, accomplished people lose everything because they couldn't do what she did in that moment. What I did was simply apply what I know. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't brave. I was trained. I had 30 years of pattern recognition and a network of people I could call without explanation. Most parents in my position would have had the same instinct, but none of the tools. The difference between us and the 6 other victims wasn't intelligence. They were intelligent people. It was access. It was that I had spent a career learning exactly how these structures are built and where they crack. I used what I had. That's all. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. The reason any of it worked, the note, the investigation, the charges, the restitution, is that my daughter didn't give up on herself. She was confused. She was embarrassed. He had been deliberately making her feel like her instincts were unreliable. That is what people like him do. They erode your confidence in your own perception until you stop trusting what you see. And still, after weeks of that, she found a scrap of paper and a pen, and she wrote down what she knew to be true. That kind of persistence, the refusal to stop believing yourself even when someone is working hard to make you doubt, that is what protected her in the end. Not me, not my contacts at the RCMP. Her. Lorraine would have seen all of this clearly from the beginning. She always could. I am slower, more methodical, less instinctive, but I showed up when it mattered, which is maybe the most a father can promise. The garden looks good now. My daughter designed it in the fall. She kept some of her mother's roses along the back fence and added a small bench near the old apple tree. It's quiet back there in the mornings. I take my coffee out and I sit, and I think about the people who never got their money back. I think about the ones who never told anyone what happened to them. I hope they find a way to write their own note. I hope there is someone waiting on the other end who knows what to do with it.